Hello and welcome back to the New Tablets podcast, and in today's episode we're going to be discussing quite a hot topic, which is free will and how it's maybe compatible or incompatible with certain ideas as to how causation works, okay? So first off, let's just discuss what people mean by true libertarian free will. So this is the idea that human beings, at least, possibly animals, can genuinely choose between alternative actions. So we can genuinely come up with original thoughts that are not necessarily influenced by external factors and then act upon those thoughts. So I can decide whether to go to one shop or another. Like, yes, it's going to be influenced by maybe one shop sells milk cheaper, maybe the other shop sells mushrooms cheaper, for example. It's been influenced by these factors, but ultimately there's something inside me making that final decision, and it could have gone either way, right? It's not entirely predictable by those external factors. Our actions are not fully determined by prior causes. So this is kind of conceiving of the self, me and you, as free agents, like we are the true origins of our actions. Now, I'd say this is actually how most people probably conceive of the idea of will and causation and decision-making, let's say. But within the philosophy field, according to this Phil Papers survey, this is from 2009, keep in mind, so these numbers might be a bit different, actually, only 14% of philosophers really agree with this libertarian free will. And if you're not particularly familiar with the philosophical arguments regarding free will, you might be thinking, how can you not agree with free will? Why do people think this might be an illogical kind of idea? So we're going to go over a few stances that maybe are going to cause problems for this, right? And the first one I'd like to bring up is a kind of causal determinism. Now, this just outright might not completely destroy the idea of free will, and we will get onto that later, but we've got to at least do this as a bit of a preliminary kind of stage to think about how causation might work so that we can then apply it to the idea of free will. So determinism is the idea that every action is caused by prior states of the universe. So action B will be influenced by action A, or I guess state A, okay? So all these different influences are coming together and influencing further actions within the universe in a very uniform manner, right? So there's a very mathematical kind of element to it. It's like, if I roll a dice at a particular velocity and a particular angle on a particular surface with a particular amount of wind resistance and air pressure and whatnot, it's going to land on a certain number. Yes, to me, that seems like kind of chance and randomness. However, the actual number it lands on is very determined under this framework. And this has all kind of implications for science, actually, because it kind of proves that these laws that we come up with in science and all the maths that goes behind it does work in the real world. And I think most physicists would probably agree with that. On the scale of something like a dice, when it's rolled at a certain velocity, a certain angle and whatnot, it's going to land on a particular number. There's no randomness involved. If we could measure all those factors very precisely, we could know what number it's going to land on before it actually lands on it. And that is determinism. Now, contrary to the idea of free will that most people seem to agree with, I'd actually say most people also seem to agree with this. They just don't tie the two ideas together in their heads necessarily, because they're experiencing this feeling of free will from a very first-person perspective, whereas they're seeing these determined, very physical, scientific actions out there in the universe. I don't think many people are going to disagree that the laws of motion work, right? I mean, we all learn about how velocity works and how energy is transferred from one object to another, say, in school, right? In GCSE physics when we're 15 years old, and we don't say, no, there must be some randomness involved. It's a very precise process, and we kind of accept that. And I think a lot of science is honestly built upon this, and a lot of the ways we act are built upon this. If we act this way, it's going to create this state of affairs next. this effect is going to create this cause. And that's determinism. The next thing we're going to move on to is, I guess, the opposite of that, and it's like a causal randomness, indeterminism, right? As you can probably tell by the name of this idea, it's basically the opposite of determinism, or at least an argument against absolute determinism. So a lot of people bring up things like quantum physics, like how there's kind of a wave function before like quantum particles actually break down the wave function. It all gets pretty complicated, but basically a lot of physicists kind of maybe think there might be random behavior within quantum physics that can't be predicted absolutely by human measurement, okay? Now, you could say, well, maybe they've just not discovered the precise techniques to measure it yet, and that it is still acting according to determinism, or you can say there's actually an element of randomness, and there probably will be people out there, even with regards to the dice that I was talking about, that would say there is an element of randomness. Like, yes, you can measure all these prior states of the world, but they're not necessarily going to result in the following effect, okay? And that's indeterminism. I'd say a lot of people also agree with this. This jives pretty well with most people's common sense that there might be certain factors that are not absolutely mathematical in that sense. Like there's a bit of probability involved. And I mean, every time anyone gambles on anything, you're kind of invoking this indeterminism. We talk about like chance and probability. Like, yes, these kind of just exist within the mathematical realm, but we act as if they exist in the real world. And if they do exist in the real world, that's indeterminism, okay? Next up, we're going to actually talk about how these ideas relate to the first idea I talked about, free will, which is obviously the topic of this episode. And first up, we're going to cover a stance called compatibilism. This is the idea that free will, as a concept, is compatible with determinism and, I suppose, indeterminism. People mostly talk about it in terms of determinism, but I think we can kind of throw indeterminism in there as well. So the compatibilist is saying that the idea of free will works perfectly fine whether you believe in determinism or indeterminism. However, it does actually reject this libertarian idea that free will is a real force within the universe, okay? So they basically reconceive of it not as something like you could have done otherwise in an absolute sense. They define free will more as like acting on your own desires, having intentions behind an action, and your kind of rationality going into the decision making without deliberate coercion from external forces. So, I mean, if I decide to go to shop B instead of shop A because of some rational decision I've made, like maybe I personally prefer the food at that shop, I'm deciding I should spend less money and that this shop is going to cost less money, then the compatibilist would say I'm making a free decision there and that is an act of free will, okay? Because I'm not being coerced by some external factor. Now, if there was someone, say, stood at the door of shop A with a gun saying, you need to shop here or we're going to shoot you, you know, if you walk into shop B, I'm going to shoot you and kill you, and then that would not be free will. That would be an act of coercion, which would be impeding on my personal freedom. So, although this does seem similar to the libertarian account of free will, the compatibilist actually does admit that our decision making is informed by previous actions, okay? So let me go over how that works. And this is actually pretty common sense as well, if we really think about it. So my personality is, of course, going to be influenced by my experience, like my previous life experience at any given point. I don't think many people disagree with this, and we can probably also agree that our life experiences are kind of out of our control, right? They're kind of external factors having an effect on us. And it's our personality that's been developed through this life experience that is making these so-called free decisions, right? So we can begin to see how they're actually not completely caused by this like agent inside us, okay? They're kind of caused by our personality, which is a product of previous effects. And Even the kind of genetic element of us, of course, is inherited from our parents, which was inherited from their parents, and those genes evolved in the first place because of external factors to us. So we kind of begin to see how everything that's influencing our decision making is actually not necessarily determined, like written in stone, because there is, of course, indeterminism in the mix for some people, but it was at least absolutely influenced by other factors, okay, other than the present moment rational process going on in our minds. And the compatibilist admits all of this. They can say, okay, whether those actions were determined and set in stone that have influenced us, or whether they were indeterminate and kind of random, like maybe the roll of a dice, if you conceive of it that way, we can still have something called free will. It's maybe just not the free will that most people talk about. And I'm kind of inclined to this stance in terms of definition. Like, if you really want to have a phrase in your lexicon called free will, okay, go for it, right? But it's not this uncaused cause. It's actually just a process of following your own desires, own intentions, and your own reasoning without, like we said, coercion. This still allows for kind of like moral responsibility, right? We can still assign the fault of an action to an individual under compatibilism. So if someone, say, murdered someone in your family, you can still kind of reasonably want to exact revenge upon them because we're assigning that action to their free will. We're giving them ownership of the action on account of their desires, their intentions, and their reasoning. And if they did it without coercion, right, you're going to want to exact revenge upon that person. Now, let's say they did do it with coercion, just to kind of illuminate the maybe difference that there is going on there. Say someone, again, pointed a gun at someone's head and said, shoot a member of this person's family or we're going to shoot you. You're going to probably not feel as much animosity towards them, right? You're kind of going to be able to relate to them and say, well, it's actually the fault of the person that was coercing you, right? So you're maybe not going to want to exact your revenge on them in that scenario. So we can see how compatibilism actually applies to the usual way we act with other human beings and the usual way we dish out moral responsibility. But remember, there's still not this agent inside the compatibilist that's saying you could have done otherwise, okay? Like, it was always going to be influenced by events out there in the external world, whether they're determined and set in stone or whether they're random. Now we're going to move on to the final stance we'll be talking about in this episode, and this is called incompatibilism. Again, this is obviously the kind of opposite or something contra to compatibilism, right? And incompatibilism posits that whether determinism is true or whether indeterminism is true, i.e. whether there's random actions in the universe or not, free will still doesn't exist. And they're keeping that definition of free will that the libertarian keeps. So we talked about how the compatibilist kind of just changes the definition of free will to make it fit in with a particular worldview. The incompatibilist says, well, no, that kind of is the definition of free will. That is how people use the word. And whether there's determinism or not, that can't exist. And let me go over why. If determinism is true, right, if every action in the universe has a very precise following action on other bits of the universe, okay, so if one bit of matter interacts with another bit of matter in a very definite and predictable mathematical way, of course there's no freedom, right, because our minds are being influenced in this very strict fashion by the rest of the universe all the time, like what we talked about with genetics and life experience and personality. All these things are being influenced in this very rigid way by previous effects. Every cause is the complete, absolute, specific result of previous effects, okay? So in this conception, there's really no room for free will. There's no room for this uncaused cause inside us making this final decision. It's absolutely just influenced by external factors. So if I choose shop B because the food is a little bit cheaper there than it is in shop A, that's because, say, maybe I've not got a well-paying job. Okay, why have I not got a well-paying job? Because maybe I didn't pay attention in school that much. I did pay attention in school, by the way. I'm just giving an example here. let's say the character in this didn't pay attention in school because of how they were raised. Maybe their parents didn't teach them to pay attention. Maybe it's a genetic factor. Or maybe it can be taken back even further. Maybe their parents didn't teach them how to teach that kind of ability to their children, okay? Like, there's all kinds of factors that can be involved, and they can all be dated further and further back through causation, through time, to previous effects, right? So when I'm choosing shop B, or, when the character in this example is choosing shop B, they're doing it as a result of everything that's happened before them in the entire universe, I guess. All their prior life experience, all their genetics, and therefore all of their ancestors' genetics and all of their prior life experience that they had, okay? And in this sense, it's like everything kind of affects everything. There's no room for individual parts of the universe, individual people, to be these completely independent causal agents. Under determinism, it all works together. Now let's talk about if indeterminism is true. So, of course, indeterminism leaves a bit of room for randomness. So, with regards to something like genetics, right, maybe indeterminism could explain certain mutations within genetics. Maybe my genes are not a direct, 100% correlated result with my parents' genes and the external factors applied to it. Maybe there's this, little bit of randomness, okay? Maybe, it's just 99% kind of caused by prior genetic information. And in terms of life experience, maybe my life experience doesn't correlate completely with previous life experience and what's going on around me. Maybe there's a little bit of randomness in, say, my sensory input, or maybe the way I process those experiences. And maybe then my personality has a little bit of randomness involved in it. Maybe when I am making decisions, there is this random kind of coin flip element to it where the final decision is maybe just random. Maybe I'm weighing up rational reasons to go to shop A or shop B, and maybe the final decision is essentially just a coin flip of sorts, where it's the rational thought process kind of collapses and a decision is just made. Now, does this leave room for free will? Absolutely not, according to the incompatibilist. And I'd probably have to agree here. This is just random stuff happening, okay? Yes, there's processes of cause and effect, and there's also randomness thrown in there with it. This isn't freedom. There's no agent inside the person actually in control of the actions that they're committing. It's just influenced by cause and effect and randomness. So if we really sum up incompatibilism, it's if everything is very determined and absolute and very mathematical, very scientific in every instantiation, right? If a certain effect has a certain definite cause, of course there's no room for freedom. Whereas if certain effects result in a kind of probabilistic cause, which then probabilistically affects further causes, that's just randomness. There's still no free will in that libertarian sense. There's still no control being given to this absolutely acausal agent within us, okay? So that's incompatibilism. Now, I thought at the end here I would just actually conclude by giving my views on this. Now, I'm a pretty strict determinist personally. I think it's just a lot easier way of conceiving of the world by thinking there are actual logical mathematical processes going on in the universe that we can discover. And anything that seems to be random is actually just a result of factors that we've not been able to measure yet. And it seems like this is kind of how science progresses, right? We kind of assume something's random, or we assume something's caused by some supernatural being. Then someone does some science and we discover laws behind it. We are able to measure the factors that have caused a thing, and then we're able to measure the resulting actions of that thing happening, and we're able to explain it with science. We're able to predict the weather now, whereas maybe thousands of years ago we attributed the weather to gods up in the sky or something like that. It just seems like a very logical way of thinking about the world, and a very practical one as well. We can really get things done if we accept determinism. We can try and find the direct cause of events without throwing in this random element and saying, well, we're never going to actually understand it. We're never going to actually be able to measure it. I don't think there's a way we can actually necessarily prove these things, but it does seem that so far, science seems to prove that determinism works. Like, when we discovered the laws of motion, we were then able to completely explain, like, the mathematics of gravity, right? Like, we can actually figure out a very precise velocity of a falling object based on its mass, based on gravity, based on air pressure and whatnot. So it does actually seem to function in the real world. Now, a problem that we could find in compatibilism is that they're kind of just changing the definition of the word free will. And I think they're kind of just changing it to mean the same thing as will, right? It's like the free part isn't really necessary. And it's like they're just obsessed with that terminology, okay? I don't know what their point really is. Like, I agree with everything they've got to say with regards to it. Like, libertarian free will can't exist. We can't be a cause directly of effects, regardless of external effects. But why we need to change the definition of free will just to be able to keep it in our common parlance, I'm not sure. Because, like, we've already got the word will. Is that not what will means? To act according to your own desires, intentions, and reasoning without coercion? Like, if I will to go to shop B, someone points a gun at me and says, don't go to shop B, my will is being coerced into willing something different then. Why we need this term free will really isn't apparent to me. Now, the compatibilist might come back and say, well, what about that moral responsibility? Somebody needs to be able to be assigned responsibility for an action, and if those actions are just caused by external effects, then how can we assign responsibility to them? And I just say we do assign responsibility to them, okay? That's what we've always done. The compatibilist is not coming along and actually changing how free will works and changing how causation works. That's how it's always worked, okay? If you admit that maybe determinism's true and maybe libertarian free will isn't real, that's how it's always been. Nothing is being taken away from you or changed to you. We have assigned moral responsibility and we have evolved like the justice system without free will. We did all that, okay? We might have been conceiving of it as libertarian free will, but we still did it without it, okay? So it's like when we look at how we punish someone for, say, murder, we might put them in prison for, say, 20 years, right? Now, what is that actually practically doing? We're protecting the general public from being murdered again, and it's the general public that puts the law in this position to inflict justice upon people. So obviously they're going to want to put someone in prison because they don't want to get murdered by them. They want them locked away somewhere so that they can be protected. Now, in prisons, we also have rehabilitation, where we try and change people into kind of more functioning members of society, right? Someone who the community would deem valuable and deem allowable to exist within the community. So this is kind of like long-term protection for the community, because once they get out of prison, they want them to not kill them again, right? And it's also kind of practical use for them. Like, they want someone who's going to be valuable to the system, someone they can use for labor and social interactions and maybe even reproduction in the future. They don't want this criminal who's completely divorced from society and that we can't control and use for some kind of practical use, right? So all those reasons are why we inflict this punishment on someone. Revenge doesn't really need to come into it. We don't need to say, let's assign moral responsibility to this person's like complete free will and then throw them in prison as like an act of revenge. We can do it completely from practical attitudes. And I think without that idea of revenge involved, we can actually come up with more practical solutions to problems. Like, if someone can be rehabilitated, we actually can invest funds into doing that. We can invest resources into making that person a more productive member of society and a safer person to be around. Instead of just saying, let's chuck them in prison for 20 years as an act of revenge, and then once we've exacted our revenge, we'll be happy and they can go about their business. Because what do we see in like America that probably is a very pro-free will country on account of its religiosity, right? We see people going into a prison system, they become parts of gangs, they become even more violent. We let them out and they commit more crime, right? If we put them in there purely to protect the public and purely to rehabilitate them into more productive members of society, I don't think we'd see that. So it's actually the fact that this moral responsibility that's coming from the free will perspective, I think it's actually harming the very public that proponents of compatibilism think that it helps, right? I think this also applies to poverty, right? Like, it's very easy in Western countries to just say, well, this person's made themselves poor through their own free will, so we're not going to help them. And whatever happens to them happens. And whatever happens to their children happens to their children. And we'll just leave them be. And we won't give them kind of benefits or any social policies or welfare policies to help them because it's their fault. Bad poor people, right? It allows us to point at people and say things like that. Whereas without free will, without compatibilism, we can kind of just say, well, they're just a product of things that have happened to them, of external effects. And if we think we can maybe help raise someone's child as a community by giving them benefits, like, or some kind of food and shelter, and produce a better human being than would be produced by just leaving them to their devices, then there's no reason not to do that, right? There's no need for this blame that says, well, it's the parents' fault this child's growing up poor, so we're just going to leave them to starve, right? Which is what a lot of kind of libertarian-y kind of people seem to think, you know, it's the attitude they seem to have. And I really think it does stem from this kind of cancerous idea of free will that's actually removing practicality from our society and from our systems. So let me know what you guys think. You know, are you a compatibilist, an incompatibilist, or do you believe in libertarian free will for whatever reason? And let me know what those reasons are, okay? You know, do you believe in determinism? Do you believe in randomness? It's all very interesting stuff. These philosophical debates have been going on for absolute centuries, and hopefully we can have a discourse about them. Hopefully we've all learned something together in this episode. I'd like to thank you all for watching, whether it was out of your own free will or not. Remember to follow me if you're on Spotify, subscribe if you're on YouTube, drop a like, drop a comment, share with your friends and family, and goodbye.